Good morning and good afternoon. Welcome to our January Global Sport Matters live show, bringing experts together to discuss issues that matter in the world of sport. Before we begin, we want to take just a moment to acknowledge that the lands where the Global Sport Institute and Arizona State University sit belong to the Maricopa and Pima peoples. In addition to the show, Global Sport Matters, the media hub powered by Global Sport Institute, has released a new digital issue examining the passions and pitfalls in American sports betting. Check out the chat for more details and links on the issue and also throughout the show. Today's conversation features speakers from many areas of the sports world. And as the NFL hiring cycle continues, our discussion aims to pick apart where the fractures are in the career pipeline for minority sports leaders and find a better pathway forward for progress. All throughout this show, we welcome everybody to input their questions and comments for the discussion and for our speakers. You can do that using the Q&A box, which is just in the bar below. If you open that up, we would love to know where you're calling in from. So go ahead and open up your Q&A box and let us know where you're calling in from. On the show today, we have Kenneth Shropshire, CEO of the Global Sport Institute and Adidas Distinguished Professor of Global Sport at Arizona State University. We have Michael Huyghue, founder of Access Sports and Entertainment, former commissioner of the United Football League, and former senior vice president of football operations at the Jacksonville Jaguars. We have Greg Moore, sports columnist at the Arizona Republic, reporting stories at the intersection of sports and culture, politics, and racial equality. And we also have Shalise Young, award-winning sports writer at Yahoo Sports with over 10 years of experience covering the NFL. And now I would like to introduce our host, Director of Research at the Global Sport Institute, Dr. Scott Brooks. Please take it away.
Hey, thanks, Kendall. It's great to see everybody. Really excited to start our conversation. So welcome. I really want to do a little bit of breakfast for dinner, right? I want to switch it around. Often in our conversations, we save that last bit for, what could be. And I want us to get to that pretty quickly, just so that we can see what develops from there. So let's talk about what's going on, right? We're in the midst of 7 teams still looking for head coaches where, we've got our ideas of what may happen. But the question that I know it's very difficult to answer, but I don't hear us talking about is what should it look like? And so I really want each of you to kind of give me a number. I spent some time last night and I said, well, okay, we've got 32 teams. Do I want 50%? What would that look like? Do I want 3/4? So I want to get a number. Why don't we start with you, Michael? If you could have a number that you think would look right, feel right to you, what would that number be in terms of head coaches?
I'm glad you started with Michael.
Yeah, I was going like this.
So you got that GM experience. You're a commissioner experience. I want to know what it could look like from your perspective.
Sure. Well, I think it's hard to pick a target, but I would say if it was balanced, if it somewhat resembled 50%. I think that would be ideal because I think when you look at the large number of players, there should be some representative reflection, I think, of the workforce. And so in that regard, it certainly doesn't represent the number of Black coaches that are in the National Football League. So the pipeline isn't, I don't think, full enough yet to fully get to that number. But I think if we're talking targets, that's where I'd feel comfortable.
All right, 50%. All right, Shalise. You got a number. Give us your number.
I've actually never thought about an actual number. Certainly more than one, which is what we have as we sit here today. 50% isn't bad. More than 10, when you write some of the things that I write, you get obviously a ton of pushback. But yeah, it has to certainly more than one. I think the most we've ever had in a single season is 6 or 7. And then obviously there's been tremendous backslide since then. So yes, a dozen, 20 would be great.
See, now you're moving up past your 50%, which is fine.
I'll shoot for it. For me, it comes down to the chance Just
Okay.
give the opportunity to any coach. You know, there are certainly lots of Black coaches who deserve even a chance. And if we find out they're not great at it, that's fine. But, you know, the chances aren't even being given.
All right. But I got you up to 20 now, so that would be that 2/3. I got you up to that.
I'll stick with Michael. Let's shoot for at least, I mean, again, I'd be happy with 25%, but 50% feels really good too.
All right. Greg, how about you? Your number?
80, 90%. I mean, this is not complicated. If 70% of the players are Black at every major level of the sport, where are the white coaching candidates even coming from? How is it not the overwhelming majority of the candidates came from having played? So you mean to tell me you can run a play, but you can't draw up a play? And you can lead men in a huddle, but you can't lead men with a ball cap on?
Right.
I don't understand how we're not somewhere in the 80, 90% range, because I don't know about y'all, but I got credit cards. I understand compound interest. Like it goes that way over time, right?
Okay. All right. We're from 50 to 80 to 90. Ken, where are you sitting?
I'm going to try to successfully not give a number after all that. You know what? I mean, the complexity is, I mean, and I often start classes out asking that question regarding race in general. You know, what's the idea? What is it we're striving for? When will this all be over? When will we not have a webinar on this kind of thing? And you know, there's two examples I think about. I really don't know at the moment. I think I heard for a while the number of NBA coaches. I mean, right now the NBA feels okay. I mean, it's not, you know, there's enough where I don't keep track of how many. And another moment that was similar, you know, kind of ebbs a little bit, but the number of Black quarterbacks. I mean, we all knew exactly how many were in the league, not just how many were starting. We knew backups and everything else. Now it feels a little bit more comfortable. There's still issues, but a little bit more comfortable in that way. And I don't know what, and Shalise is right, I think it was like 7 or 8 at one point, which was, you were getting into it, starting to feel like, okay, here we go. But it still wasn't that number. So did I make it yet?
No, you still got to give a number.
Yeah.
We haven't forgotten. You haven't said a number.
So it is, I'd say somewhere, it is north of 8 for sure. And the complexity is, you know, and I think about the legal issues of like, you know, what would a court say? You know, you need to, who's, you know, that dreaded word, who's qualified, which is something that keeps moving on us, especially because, you know, I mean, Greg's right. You know, 80% is easy if you think about who's qualified. But if you look at specific markets and all this sorts of stuff, you know, court might tell you you can't pinpoint it in the same way that you can pinpoint the number of people that should be engineers in Detroit at GM. Right? You can better measure that kind of thing. So I'll stick with north of 8.
All right. Well, so, you know, part of this is the research in me that's thinking we need to have a metric so that we know where we're going, right? Part of what I find to be the challenge is we wait year to year and then we're disappointed, but we don't have anything like, well, here is how far short the league is. Here is, right? That for me is one piece. I think the other, we look at how we did Title IX, basically said needs to be 1-to-1 ratio men and women, right? So if with that idea of proportionality or creating something like that would make sense to me too, as another thought of it. And then once you have a metric, if it is the 80%, 90%, or somewhere around there, each year we can measure. And I think about organizations. When an organization, some of the organizations came out and said, we are lacking diversity, they set up targets and they even came up with plans. Internally, can we do this? And if not, what is your development program, right? You should have a development program that says, if we don't have enough people, we're going to bring some in from outside, but on the inside, we've got work to do. And so, Michael, you know, when I think of the work we could be doing to help produce that pipeline, as you spoke of, give us first a sense of, does that actually happen? Do organizations think of the work they could be doing to develop talent internally? And then what might that look like if we were to engage in that?
Well, they do, but the balance is so misplaced. When you look at how carefully we're able to dissect all the criteria to select players and how comprehensive we can be in selecting players, it makes sort of a failed hiring system in the front office look a little unfortunate, because we're so good at delineating, small nuances and thousands of athletes. But somehow we have a hard time getting it right with respect to coaches and front office people. And I think maybe the same way we negotiate collective bargaining issues, metrics could be part of that, at least as targets, so that clubs understood that if they were going to implement new DEI programs, if you were negotiating, you would certainly feel that 50-50 was fair, because for every opportunity, you were giving equal chance to both races. So that is a target that wouldn't be achieved overnight, but I think at some point metrics become important so that folks are held accountable.
Yeah, absolutely.
That might be interesting. 50-50 hiring. For every opening that comes up, if there's 2 openings that come up, 1 ought to go to a Black candidate, and then just let that move forward. So you're not really looking back, you're looking forward. That could be interesting.
Yeah.
I think a big part of the problem specific to the NFL is it's 32 separate companies, and that's where the NFL league office in New York City, they can implement those sorts of things. But at the end of the day, are we going to go to Jerry Jones, the owner of the Dallas Cowboys, and Robert Kraft, the owner of the New England Patriots, and get them to agree that they each have to, if Jerry hires a Black head coach, which is funny to even think of, but if Jerry even hires a Black head coach, then Robert doesn't have to. I think this is where a big part of the problem comes in, is we're talking about 32 separate entities who run things the way that they want to.
The hard part about that is, at times, while that is completely true, it becomes a bit of an excuse as well. So, for example, all 32 teams have agreed to share revenues evenly. All 32 teams have agreed to a collective bargaining agreement. All 32 teams agreed to uniform policies with respect to player waiver system, free agency, termination. There is a number of issues that the league comes together sharing of marketing dollars, in the sense that they all share their collective marks. So sometimes it's convenient for the teams to say, we're 32 separate operators, and yet there's a plethora of issues that they all are bound by and have agreed to. And if they wanted to, they could make hiring one of those uniform policies.
That's a great point. I mean, Ken, as we often hear from you thinking about the law part, right? And can we enforce this with privately owned organizations like this? How do you think about that? The fact that there are these ways in which they do come together, so they can't just say they're totally separate, and yet there's this challenge.
Well, very, very difficult. And as certainly as communications gotten more sophisticated, I mean, Donald Sterling shows things can be revealed that may come out that you don't want known. But for the most part, these are sophisticated business people who know not to say, I'm not going to hire the Black man in any kind of public kind of setting, or to have any kinds of standards that set forth that no person of color could ever get this kind of job. It's I wrote a book several years ago, a couple decades ago, and I still remember this one owner. I think it was a basketball owner who actually said it, that with all these things that the central office can do, whatever league headquarters, whatever league you're talking about, set up all these standards and the like. He sort of said it's like your parents telling you how to go out and find a spouse. That they may tell you all this stuff, but in the end, you're going to do what you want to do. And this owner said that the quote is almost exactly what he said. It's a very intimate decision. It's like choosing a wife. That was especially a couple of decades ago, especially the racial elements of that did not go without being understood. So and I do take it that it's a very intimate decision. I don't take it that it's it's at that level, but I don't own a $4 billion enterprise either.
It's not at that level because they fire coaches after 1 year. I don't know a whole lot of marriages.
I don't know. We check
We
check the fire and the divorce rates. We can put them side by side.
Listen, I hear you. I do. I understand that. But it was my understanding that marriage was supposed to be for life. And there's only one coach who I think has anything near that type of protection, and that's Mike Tomlin. And if he didn't have that, I don't know that he'd be in that job. I think that for me, I wonder where are the white people on this issue speaking up? How come we don't pose this question to white writers nearly as often as we pose it to black writers? How come we don't pose this question to white ball players as nearly as often as we pose it to black ball players, Hispanic ball players, white coaches, white executives? When white people speak up and when white fans say, we think Eric Bieniemy's better than the guy y'all got in my town right now, when white fans start saying that and saying, you know what, I'm just going to sell my ticket to somebody who's going to wear the wrong jersey. And, I don't know if owners really care about that because the ticket still gets sold and the popcorn still gets sold and the soda still gets sold. But if fans, black, white, and otherwise, start to say, I don't really care if that team's on TV or not, because I don't believe they hired the best candidate, because the best candidate was coaching in Kansas City last week, and he scored a touchdown in 13 seconds, then messed around and won the game in the greatest game I ever saw. How come that guy's not a coach? So until we start to get that kind of push, we're all just going to fill up the air. I'm really handsome. Y'all want to look at me. We can do this. We can talk. But if y'all want some solutions, where's the white folks?
You brought up a great point. I mean, thinking about what can be done, right? You've introduced fans. Shalise, when you're thinking about this, are there others what are the other groups that could be doing something? So we've got fans here. Do you think there's something coaches could do? Would it be the athletes? Who else could help push this ball forward?
The advertisers. The companies that give the NFL millions and millions of dollars to be associated with them. Nike has gotten a great deal of positive publicity over the last couple of years for, partnering with Colin Kaepernick, and reluctantly, but they, changed their policy toward female athletes and pregnancy and things like that. That was an issue in the track and field world. But why aren't they going to the NFL and saying, hey, we pay a lot of money to be associated with you. We don't like the optics of this. X percent of the people who spend billions and billions of dollars every year on our shoes and apparel are Black people and non-white people. And when they watch an NFL game, they're not represented, at least not in the powerful positions. We all can point to lots of low-level position coaches who are non-white, but it's still rare, especially now that we see, now the way to be a head coach is to be an offensive coach. Well, there's 4 Black offensive coordinators and there are 4 Black quarterback coaches this season, and none of them are on the same teams. So, to me, it's advertisers. The players themselves could say something, but as much as I respect NFL players, they don't even strike for their own financial gain. So I don't think they would do it for, coaches and things like that. So, but advertisers are certainly one place where we could and should, for 18 months ago, or whatever it was, all those Black squares and Black Lives Matter. Well, this is part of that, Black squares on Instagram do nothing.
So Michael, talk a little bit about that pressure, perhaps that the advertisers, those sponsors could push to make some things happen.
Well, I think this whole concept of influencers and having an impact on the leagues is kind of a nostalgic question, because I think everyone believes that these entities all have more influence or impact than they do. I think when we talk about the fans in general think they have a presence in the game, that they're what drives the interest. And when you're a general manager in the league, the first thing they tell you is that if you listen to the fans, you'll be sitting with the fans. And at the club level, I've been in the league for 30 years and I've never heard a conversation in a meeting start out with, here's something the fans are saying. I mean, I think the simple truth is that they're placated, but owners and teams really don't care about fans. Fans come because they pay the tickets and they're a part of the process. But their interests are really more for talk radio than they are for anything to do with the teams. I mean, Mel Kiper and all that draft stuff, no one in the NFL ever considers any of that. They do that all themselves. And when the Masters tournament was being driven back because of racial inequity and sponsors said, we're not going to pay to advertise during the Masters, they did the Masters with no advertising. And they got more ratings because there was no commercial interrupted. And they decided they were prepared to do that, going forward. And so I think that there's a resistance and a belief sometimes that the impact is there that may not fully be there in terms of how billionaires react to those kinds of pressures. I think perhaps the players are probably the best resource to have a real impact on it, but I think, and to Shalise's point, even in their own CBA negotiations, they haven't been as strong in terms of, holding a stance. So it's probably going to have to take some collective efforts, but those individual, sponsors, advertisers, fans, I don't see that moving the needle.
It's my sincere hope that NFL owners, sports teams owners in general, are involved for the right reasons, which is to say civic pride and sort of pride of ownership. Like, this is my team and we're the best team, and bragging rights. So when the billionaires get in the billionaires club, there's one of them who kind of has the bragging rights to say, you know what? I put together the best team. That's my squad. And if that's the case, you want the best talent. And if you want the best talent, then you have to look everywhere for it, not just in the typical places, because if you look in the typical places, you'll find the typical results. But again, I do think money talks. I hear you, but I think money talks.
Yeah, one thing that kind of struck me as you said that, Michael, and I, part of me is like, that makes perfect sense. But when I remember seeing Jerry Jones take a knee, then I went, but why did Jerry do that then, right? So that makes me go, maybe it's about the size of the fan protest, right? Maybe that's what it is. That in general, no, it may not. But what may have provoked Jerry to have to do that? If we can kind of claim to think we can understand Jerry, why would he switch up if it didn't matter, or what did matter that made him switch up?
Well, Jerry kneeled because, if we remember, that was when the 45th president of the United States called NFL players sons of bitches. Mm-hmm. So, that was the one time that we saw players, speaking out in larger numbers. And so Jerry kneeled. Jerry kneeled because he knew the cameras would be there. And so the cameras could show him kneeling. And for one day, or at least for 3 minutes of the playing of the national anthem, he could show that he supported the plight of his Black players beyond the walls of AT&T Stadium. Let's be perfectly transparent about that. I don't think Jerry Jones cares, other than, in that moment, that week, as we remember, Donald Trump called players sons of bitches. Players were rightfully enraged. And that's what led to, and if you notice, one of the more famous NFL or infamous NFL pictures of the last few years is Jerry Jones looking directly in the camera with this look on his face to be like, are you people happy now?
I was there that day. I'm glad that came up. I was there that day. I spoke to players in the locker room after the kneeling. I spoke to team owner of the Arizona Cardinals, team president Michael Bidwell. I did not make it over and speak to Jerry Jones. I remember in the moment feeling like that was a brilliant compromise, that there were people who said protesting during the national anthem is enough to exclude whatever it is you're saying that is so offensive to me that I can't hear you. I disagreed with that position, but I understood that was their position. So what happened was everybody took a knee before the playing of the anthem. And I thought to myself, now that's showing that they understand that this isn't about the anthem. This is about racism and police brutality. I remember thinking that was pretty darn cool. Also remember, this would have been later, the NFL commissioner saying, we made a mistake. we did not listen to our players early enough. We did not take their concerns seriously enough. And when Roger Goodell said that, then there was a video from players that came out right behind it. And there has been a visible push toward, end racism in the end zone and inspire change on the helmets. And I think that kind of sloganeering is a great start to a conversation. And now we need to show results. I would love to see Black players start to pool their money and go right into the communities and say, this is something that we see that needs a change, and here's what we're doing about it. And then everybody can follow behind, because these players are best positioned, because they came from those communities, that they're best positioned to lead that charge. I would love to see more results. But again, if we are sticking to coaches, I don't understand how you can say that you want to win football games and that you can tell your fan base and you can tell everybody around that you want to do the best you can to win a championship. And clearly there are people who can help you toward that goal that aren't getting the same opportunity. I just, I want to see that. And I want to see it come from white journalists, white players, white coaches. I want a white coach to say, hey, by the way, my buddy over here who I came up through the ranks with, I'm telling y'all, he's the goods. And if something should happen to me where I don't do this job to the best of everybody's standards, hire that guy, because I'm telling you, that guy's good. I want to hear more of that kind of stuff come out, because I think this can be solved. I think there's will here. And I think that, we all have the same goal. I think we can get there as long as we don't get to all, bullying and forcing each other. And I think that makes people stand back. But I think if we're all working toward the same goal, I think we're in business.
Greg, I think we got to, I agree with that. I mean, it'd be great to have allies in the battle and speaking up in moments like that. And the one thing that's been nagging at me was the GM hire by the Bears, African-American, and he comes from Kansas City. And as we all know, kind of the big candidate for the long haul has been Eric Bieniemy. And I don't know what deal was struck with him, because the announcement comes of the hiring of a new head coach the day after he's hired, and it's not Eric Bieniemy. And it is just the messaging is so severe that you're the one guy, you're the one GM that knows this candidate. And whatever you did in this process, you weren't able to success. Again, we don't know what the man did. You weren't able to successfully elevate Bieniemy to be.
I wanted Leslie Frazier for the Bears jobs. Leslie Frazier was a starter on the '85 Bears defense. Are you kidding me? How do you go anywhere other than Leslie Frazier?
We'll take Leslie as 1 or 1A, whatever it might be. That we have this dream too, that if we only had more African American owners, that would be the answer. I mean, there's so many things that we think would be the path to this. And one thing that we know from this kind of long battle is the owners can do it in an instant. I mean, without all this, I'm glad nobody's kind of talking about, we need more training. We need to be more eloquent in our interviews, sort of all that kinds of stuff. But it comes down to owners making that decision. And I would say that, to Greg's point, and kind of amplifying the hiring by the Bears, once you get in a position to do something, if an owner gives you the power to make a decision that moves the needle, and so far that has not happened.
Professor Nicole Lavoie, Tucker Center at University of Minnesota, she looked at the NCAAs, and she was really trying to test this hypothesis of really the trickle down, right? If you hire diverse candidates in leadership, in that case, it's athletic director, will you see a trickle down? But there's research, and George Cunningham, professor at Texas A&M, talks about this, the glass cliff. And this is, even when you go back to the Rooney Rule and the early research there on the last hired, first fired, the glass cliff, if you're not familiar, is really that we get hired into struggling teams, right? Then we have shorter tenures, particularly if we have any rough runs. So we're fired right off of these rough runs. And historically, we've been fired with higher winning percentages. And then the last part of it is the white savior. So then that is followed up with the white hire that then comes in and saves the day. So Michael, when you hear this and we're thinking about what actually happened, part of the Bears thing, if in the short tenure you're under the gun, it's pressurized, you don't feel like you can really take the risk to hire even the staff that you may want because you're scrutinized, right? Any of that could be cause to blame you. How does all this kind of work together? From your experience, do you see this glass cliff? Is that a real thing from your perspective? And then, what could be done to maybe mitigate some of that?
Well, I think it starts at this whole, and I think Ken was hitting on it earlier about what the qualifications and how we define qualifications. It's interesting when we talk about Black coaches, almost 99% of them were former players. The vast majority of white coaches were not. And we've tried to define the role of a coach as a CEO, as someone who's a leader, not necessarily who someone comes imbued with all the qualities of a former player. And so part of this process is the way we analyze the job that we think coaches are doing is biased by the fact that so many people, owners and presidents who hire coaches, see Black coaches first as former players. I think Greg even mentioned, about Leslie going to the Bears, because we symbolically think of them as athletes on the team moving up to a coaching position as opposed to leaders, CEOs who can manage teams. We then think that they aren't as equipped in those crisis situations to manage them because they're just former players. And so this whole qualifications thing, and then I think the lens in which we see how they operate in that bubble of a bad team with a lot of crisis going on, gets the Cully situation where you think, oh no, it's too much for them. And then in a very short leash, you get rid of them. So I think it just starts with this whole concept that they're not CEOs, they're former players. Whereas the Sean McVays, the Sean McDermotts, the Green Bay coach, all of those folks can go in and never played pro football and be seen more as gurus and smart guys and that sort of thing.
And to clarify, our research shows that the majority of head coaches have college experience. Most of them have pro, but those who do not, yes, until recently, those who don't have that highest level of playing experience, all of them were white, right? And you can have even those who are fewer. I'll come right to you, Greg. I want to ask Shalise a question about this because you've looked at the whole nepotism part, right? And so in this, when we talk about those who don't have the experiences, what are you finding? You've done some great work at saying, well, there is a nepotism route, but it doesn't work the same when you add race.
No, it doesn't. I started the work, The Defector did a great article a few weeks ago on this, and I'm going to fumble the numbers. I believe it's 14% of all NFL coaches. And that's from, the lowest level assistant on up to head coaches. I think it's about 14% are related to another coach. And of that number, it's like 75% of them are white coaches. You look at the Minnesota Vikings in particular, and they're looking for a new head coach now, but under Mike Zimmer's son was the co-defensive coordinator. He had only been in the league for, 5 or 8 years or something like that. And he gets to be co-defensive coordinator. Meanwhile, the Black man, who is also the co-defensive coordinator, had been coaching for 30 years, had been in the NFL for 16 years. It's the first time he gets to be a coordinator level. And here he is sharing it with the coach's son. And the offensive coordinator of the Minnesota Vikings was Clint Kubiak, who was the son of Gary Kubiak, who was the offensive coordinator for the Minnesota Vikings for a couple of years. Clint's on his staff as an assistant. And while they did, of course, interview some non-white candidates, as the Rooney Rule stipulates they must, they just, Clint Kubiak's resume is as flimsy as wet Kleenex, realistically speaking. So, we keep bringing up Eric Bieniemy. And of course, he unfortunately doesn't want any of this, but he's the poster child. And it's interesting, we talk about who's standing on the table. We've all seen and heard Andy Reid year after year after year now talk about how great Eric Bieniemy is. And yet, and still, 13 interviews, I believe, on the previous interviewing cycles, the previous 3 years, maybe he has 2 requests this year, I think. There's so much news that goes on a day-to-day basis, but, there's so many coaches. And again, we're talking so much about, now you see the trend on offense. I believe the previous 4 hiring cycles, 30 of the 40 head coaches who were hired all come from offensive backgrounds. It's a full 3/4. And the numbers just aren't there for, the quarterback's coach becomes the OC then becomes the head coach. Well, of the season that we're concluding right now, only 4 of the 32 offensive coordinators were Black, and one of them was a co-coordinator in Miami.
Yeah, I think one of the problems with the nepotism rule is that so much of ownership reflects that. So a lot of the owners today are sons or daughters of their parents who were the owners of the team. So they don't necessarily see nepotism as a bad thing because it's how they rose to their level. And so, Dan Rooney passed it on to his son, and Mara has his son running. And if you look at, and the Colts passed it on, and the Browns, and almost every one of those situations, you have a sibling of the owner running the team. So when they see nepotism in the coaching ranks, it's actually familiar because it represents the ownership structure in many ways, whereas in a more corporate setting, it would be more frowned upon. But in the league, which is so mom and pop driven in its origination, you see so much of that in ownership as well.
Great, you've been waiting.
Yeah, no, I'm grateful to have heard from you guys. I appreciate that, Shalise and Michael. Let me just start by saying D'Amico Ryans, Leslie Frazier, Vance Joseph, Byron Leftwich, Todd Bowles, Mel Tucker, Jim Caldwell, Marvin Lewis. I can do this for a minute, right? So let's just start with that. And I don't think I mentioned Bieniemy when I did that. So when we talk about who is seen as a leader, and we talk about former players and whether former players are seen as leaders, I wonder if anybody ever said that Gerald Ford was not a leader because he played college football. I wonder if anybody ever said that Ronald Reagan wasn't a leader because he played college football. I wonder if anybody ever said Bill Bradley wasn't a leader because he played NBA basketball. And so I think that conversation about who we see as a leader is not about former players. It's about something else. I'm blacking out on what that might be, but it's about something else.
My friend Howard Bryant has written extensively on Major League Baseball, and every major league manager also played in Major League Baseball. Not even AAA, or like, you have to have reached the highest level of the sport in baseball as a Black man. And we all know what those numbers look like anyway. So basically they're unicorns, essentially. And the number is not cool. It's a little better. I think it's similar for NBA, Black NBA coaches as well. When you look at and he's been there for years and he's had success, but the coach in Miami, who is like a video guy, I cannot imagine a Black guy who comes into an NFL team as, a video breakdown guy. And then a couple of years later, they're, hailing him as a genius.
I think the thing that frustrates me the most when I think about baseball is that old Chris Rock bit where he lives in this super exclusive neighborhood and his neighbors are like Mary J. Blige and Eddie Murphy and Patrick Ewing. And those are the only Black neighbors in the city. The rest of his neighbors are white people. They're like a dentist, and he's not the greatest dentist of all time. He's just a dentist, a regular. And then Chris Rock makes the point that Black people have to fly to somewhere white people have an opportunity to walk to. Now, the overwhelming majority of my life, I'm 43, I've been pushing back against that. Like, that can't be true, right? Like, that can't be true. But then when you look at baseball, there are 2 Black managers and they were both in the World Series over the last 2 years. There's 1 Black guy in charge of operating a baseball team and putting together, and his team was in the playoffs last year. And then last year, there was 1 Black guy, 1 Black player in the World Series. And he was at one point a front runner for World Series MVP. And then 2 years ago, there was 1 Black player in the World Series. He scored from first base without a ball getting hit out of the infield and got robbed for the MVP. And so baseball, to me, I get most frustrated when I just think about how much baseball has meant to Black people, for how long it has meant that. And now all of a sudden we are confronted with the reality that the only Black candidates that get these opportunities in baseball are among the best in the sport. Like, where is the average Black manager who's winning 80 games or maybe 75 games? Why are there only 2, and why are they the 2 best in the sport? I can't be the only one who sees this. And that's enough to make you go crazy if you stop and think about it. How come I'm the only one saying this? What happened here?
And Greg, and to put you over the edge, then there's a decline in the number of Black players. You're down to 7 point whatever percent now. So the odds of, if that's the paradigm, the odds get even worse as we stop playing the game. Yeah, if you go around sport, I mean, that could be other league questions. Who's doing the worst and who's doing the best. There's no, you can give NBA some props in a lot of areas, but it's still not a sense of permanence there. There's still some discomfort that things could change there as well. But football's got this way down a number. Think about it. I mean, that for perspective, you got 1 in the NFL with, and this is not the denominator. You got 60-70% players, and you've got 2 in MLB with 7-8% players. So who's doing better? I mean, who gets the D and who gets the D minus? I don't know. Who gets the F plus?
And to build on that even further, I mean, if you spend any time online, a lot of Pittsburgh Steelers fans think that Mike Tomlin should have been replaced a few years ago. If Mike Tomlin hadn't had the early success that he did, getting to 2 Super Bowls in the first 5 years of his tenure or whatever it was, he might be gone already. Because he had that early success, I think it's bought him a lot of runway. But if you spend time on Twitter, which unfortunately, I have to, and you look at message boards and things like that, there are Pittsburgh fans who are fine if he left. And he's the first coach in NFL history who has never had a losing season in 15 years, his first 15 years as a head coach. And, I'm going to be incredibly, we all saw Ben Roethlisberger officially retired yesterday. As far as we know, they have no one in the pipeline who's even close to as talented as Ben Roethlisberger. This year's draft is not a good draft for quarterbacks, if you listen to the draft experts. And what happens if he does go 5-12 next year? It's clearly not his fault. Ben Roethlisberger should have retired a year or 2 ago, really. But when you have a franchise icon like that, you have to kind of let them hang around for as long as they want to. And what happens now? What is the cry going to be like with Steelers fans through no fault of his own if the Steelers go 5-12 next year or worse?
I'm really happy you brought us to that, because that we're going to spend a little bit more time just taking a look at Mike Tomlin as the case study of how to get it right? But before we do that, I want to kind of summarize what we've talked about and even add to what we've done at the Institute. So we've come up with some takeaways. We tried to look at, put a twist on it. We know what the issues are. What might we be able to do? And so our first one was, don't let age serve as a deterrent, right? Because what you see in age is that Black head coaches, when they get that opportunity, they're all around this mid-40s age. When you see white coaches, they're at either end. So you get a McVay who's like 30, and you can get a Bruce Arians who's in his 70s, I believe, right? So you get this wide gap. We're really all clustered in that one age. And so they get, as Michael said earlier, right? They're the savants. They're seen as the prodigies, right? They're so brilliant. And so by that age part, that's one thing. So don't let that serve as a deterrent. College head coaching experience should be more of a plus. We're not coming, we have some of our black or non-white head coaches, if they've had any college experience, it just doesn't seem to translate into the head coaching thing. Whereas when you're looking at white head coaches, even when you look at the recent fumble with Urban Meyer, they can kind of go back and forth, right? And we see that, saw it in basketball, Brad Stevens. You can even go back to a Patino. We don't seem to be able to do that back and forth, right? We get stuck and it doesn't seem to matter as much. The equal weight around playing experience. Playing experience seems to be one of these prereqs. We know for whites, less of them, have that as a prereq, but it doesn't seem to matter, right? Again, as you all have addressed, that playing experience could be a negative, and that's not the same when we're looking at it for whites. So finding a way to make sure that there's more weight to that. Given this second chance, we see more second chances, but getting even more, right? Tomlin has done this in one chance. And how many people can lead an organization on their first shot and make it work, right? That's just not what typically happens. If Belichick didn't get here, this is not his first head coaching stint. And yet he's going to be a Hall of Famer for sure. We have be cognizant if your organization is one of those that has never hired a coach of color, right? Think about that. And then make sure that that helps to inform, right? And then the last one is do not rely solely on your usual sources. And that's the classic, as Greg keeps alluding to, right? This pool. If you're looking to win, you should be looking for the most talented coaches. And so I think the other stuff that I feel like we've added, and Michael started this with who can actually impact the owners, sounds like the players could potentially do something else. Maybe it's through collective bargaining. Perhaps that's the protection, because individual players suffer a price when they come out and say this, right? Or they do things around this. So I think that's where we are. If we dig into the case study, how does a Tomlin, how can we learn from what we've got here with Mike Tomlin? So how can we learn from the Tomlin situation? What are the things you think that has allowed him to stay, to be successful?
Well, so we got, as they say, N of one. So I don't know how much we really learn from what happens there. The guy who the rule is named after hires somebody, sort of abiding by the rule, and then Tomlin violates the rule by having early success. So you get a little bit of sticks there for a while, which is counter to, since Greg brought in baseball, Dusty Baker is kind of and Tony Dungy too. Examples of kind of classically where we go, we take them so far, and then there's some kind of belief too that, well, we need something else to get it over the top. And, Tony with Tampa Bay and Dusty everywhere he's been, has been kind of that kind of aura. I don't think we can talk about Tomlin without talking about what, and Shalise probably has more data on this than me, what's been absent from that. The idea would be a combination of Tomlin having success, the longevity, and doing what Dungy did, and that is to put other people in place, like Jim Caldwell, to get the next job, or to get the job, pure succession, or to go out and have a real network out there. And I just don't think we've seen that for African-American coaches from him in that kind of way. So when you say, let's use him as a model, it may just be more of an outlier than something we can use as a model.
Well,
That's my one
let
big
me weigh in
frustration
just a
with
sec
Mike
on that,
Tomlin.
Shalise, and then I'll call you in on it. One way to think about it is Rooney was invested in it, and we knew he was invested in it. I think when you look at Al Davis seemed invested in creating additional opportunities. You got a Plunkett, right? You've got a Tony Flores. He brought Art Shell back twice. Then he brings in Hugh. I think that that investment seems to be really important. With Tony Dungy and the Colts, we got a back-to-back black coach. And so if we're looking at, let's say, hopefully, I don't want to cause this to Tomlin, but if he is nearing the end of his term with the Steelers, the hope would be if they follow like the Colts, well, if Tomlin was successful, then we should follow it up with another black coach, right? Maybe this is what helps us. But so I would think maybe there's something in there that we could pull. You're right. The sample size is far too small, but maybe there's some pieces. Shalise,
I mean,
what else? What else?
Brock didn't bring another black president in behind him. Come on.
Well, the question is whether he was successful, right? Like those become those challenges. With Tomlin, he won Super Bowls, right? A president is kind of riskier. How are we determining what he won, right? That's subjective more so.
Specific to Mike Tomlin, he's never had a black coordinator. So he had the same defensive coordinator for a long time, but he has changed offensive coordinators multiple times. He did interview Pep Hamilton for offensive coordinator last year, again, because he had to interview a non-white candidate, but he just ended up promoting the guy he already had in-house. He does have a defensive coordinator opening right now, and we will see, because I know one of my friends who also has covered the NFL for a long time has called him out publicly and had a discussion with Mike about this and how he has not hired a black coordinator in his time. It's good to go on television shows, as we have seen Tomlin do, and talk about how he's the only one or one of the few or what have you, but he's in that seat to at least help somebody, right? That's what we've seen time and time and time again. You're a coordinator before you become a head coach. He's in that seat where he can have somebody else be in that position. I do wonder sometimes how much is in play in terms of the politics of things for black head coaches, that if they have too many of us, does it then become a negative for them with the GM or with the owner, with the fan base, that, there's just too many black people. So of course, that's why they fail. We all know that this could be a possibility. And I also, I wonder if that's in play for some of these black head coaches, because as of right now, there are 2 coaching staffs that have black OCs, black DCs, and black special teams coordinators, and it's Tampa Bay and San Francisco. But those are white head coaches.
So, Michael,
Scott, I was going to say there's a little, sociological theory on that too. You want to talk about that?
Yeah,
how strong it exists or not? Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, and it goes along with that glass cliffs theory, the idea of your freedom, right? And can you activate the resources? Do you feel comfortable being able to activate the resources? Do you actually have the control? So thinking of the opportunity to be a head coach and GM, or, you think of the influences that some coaches have had, and we had that string more so, it seems, in the NBA, men's NBA, but you get that string where coaches were only signing deals, or the big name coaches would only sign deals, it seemed, if they could affect that roster, right? If they could make some decisions on that roster. So Tomlin, perhaps, as Shalise has alluded to, doesn't really have the power. He's a token, right? And I don't mean it from his standpoint. He's proven it. But if you're that one only, right, do you really have the power, the backing, comfort to be able to do that? And so, Michael, your role as a GM, you've seen that, right? You kind of know how that pressure works on the organization, side of the organization.
I mean, a couple things. Number one, if you're looking at Mike Tomlin versus the others, he kind of fits in that category of a college football player that didn't play pro football, and one of the unique black head coaches that doesn't come from that and hasn't been seen as a prior player. He also came to a program that has a history of only having 3 head coaches in any recent time frame. So there's a longevity built into that. He also had the unique position of having a franchise quarterback, which very few black head coaches have had and been able to ride. But I think what makes it difficult for Mike Tomlin to have black coordinators is not just so much that he may or may not have the power, but you have 19 coaches on that staff. And when you expect the other 15 coaches to put everything into it, when the head coach and the coordinators are Black, that's a dynamic that they've never operated under and worked under, and oftentimes aren't comfortable. How many times have white people gone to an all Black restaurant, even once in their life, or an all Black anything? So when you get people who feel that they're very professional in their career as assistant coaches and hoping to be coordinators, they've never worked in a situation where the head coach was Black and the coordinators were Black and everybody that their boss was Black. And so it's difficult to bring quality white coaches into a situation like that. And so when you're a head coach, you can't just think about the coordinators, you got to fill 16 other positions. And so that's a challenge too.
I want the best offensive coordinator because that's going to give me a chance to win. And if there's a racist who can't work underneath a Black guy, I don't want him on my staff anyway, because he's not going to be the best guy to lead a team that has Black people on it. So if you're uncomfortable because there's Black people in charge, that's a you problem, not a me problem. And I'm trying to win games.
It's true, but the problem is all those people have to work on your staff, and they're not going to just wave a flag that say, I'm a racist. But what they'll do is effectively undercut the morale, they'll undercut the ability, and it just permeates through that organization. It's like all these spark plugs, and if they're not all firing in the right direction, it creates a problem. And so you've got to do the best you can, just like you build your team, to try to make sure that that unit of coaches are all going in the same direction. That's where the challenge comes in.
You know, and I'm not looking for any alibis for owners, but that's probably some of the logic they go through when they say, I can't hire, the Black head coach would be, but, I don't know if he can lead. So this gets back to that issue about just misconceptions.
Sure.
Pre-existing kinds of, prejudices about who should be in what roles, as incorrect as they are.
Correct.
It fits into the logic. And again, and they know enough not to articulate that aloud.
It's interesting. We keep talking about leadership. I covered the New England Patriots for almost a decade, and I think almost all of their draft picks from year to year would have been team captains at their colleges. And, if we're looking at 4 or 5 team captains, college rosters are between 80 and 100 players. So why is, they're good enough to be leaders? I think this, we've talked about this a couple of times. Like, if you're chosen to be a leader on a team of one of 5 leaders on a team of 90 athletes from all different backgrounds, from all different, races, religions, whatever the case may be, isn't that leadership? If you find that important enough that you only want to draft team captains, why then would that not make you a good leader to be a coach, to be a head coach? And I bring up Bill Belichick. He's had very few Black coordinators. The only Black coordinator he has was somebody who had very extensive named coordinator, I should say. Brian Flores was the de facto coordinator, but never actually got that title before he was hired by the Miami Dolphins. So Romeo Crennel, his defensive coordinator, but Romeo had 20 plus years of experience as a coach in the NFL when Bill made him a defensive coordinator in New England.
Players that retire and go into the workforce face the same bias. They go into corporate America and people only see them as former athletes. They refuse to see them in leadership capabilities. They start the interview by talking about reflecting on their careers. And it permeates throughout all of corporate America that we just can't take the label off of them being athletes, and the pejorative way we think of their lack of education and being guided through the system because of their athletic prowess. And when the time comes to give those players leadership roles, so many people pass because they just, white and Black, have this bias that you're a jock. And that by definition means you can't be a leader. You don't have intellectual capabilities beyond your sport.
It's interesting you say that. I've gone out of my way to downplay my experience playing college football. I played at Wayne State, which is a Division II school, and I was not a good football player. But I would go out of my way to just not even bring up the experience because I was concerned about that. Then I heard Michael Crow, who's a white man, who's the president of Arizona State University, said something to the effect of, he was a jock and he was an athlete in college. And if anybody tried to pick a fight with him, you get a fight with him. You might not win the fight, but you know you were in a fight. And that kind of grit and that kind of tenacity and that kind of resilience and that kind of competitive spirit is the exact kind of trait that you would want in corporate America. And so the only thing I can think at that point is that there are people actively holding back the best candidates because they're afraid of getting passed up. And that's really troubling. And if that's happening in the NFL at the NFL level, where there are really, really strong candidates, if you want college guys, okay, so Mel Tucker, James Franklin, Herm Edwards, sure, I'm forgetting some super obvious African-American coaches. Thank you. Yeah, David Shaw, thank you. That aren't getting those opportunities. It would chill me to my core to know that in a paragon of competitiveness, in an area where all we expect is winning, and that's the only thing we measure by is who's winning. If we're not going out and getting the best candidates to complete that goal, that would hurt. That would hurt. And I wonder if fans wouldn't turn away from the enterprise in droves if they believe that. Like, would they tune in to get inundated with Bud Light commercials and get inundated with Gatorade commercials and get inundated with opportunities to gamble? Because why would you gamble if you don't think that everybody is trying to win equally? I don't know, guys. It just, I hope that what you're saying is not true. I'm a little naive sometimes. I really hope that I'm wrong here.
I'm inspired by your optimism, I have to say.
You know, the way the league revenues work, Cincinnati for years profited off of that. The mindset was go 8-8, win the home games. And, it costs you more money to go to the playoffs because you have to pay for the players' travel. You have to pay for things that cost you more in salaries. But the league's new 10-year deal that pays them $11 billion per year in network rights fees rewards every team with about $250 million per team in television payments. And so, the pressures to win are, nice, but economically, it may not hurt your value. The Broncos are about to be sold, and they're going to have the largest valuation of any franchise ever sold, likely. And they haven't won a Super Bowl recently. And so, the Cowboys are probably the largest value franchise in the NFL. Hell, they've only won 3 or 4 playoff games in the last 25 years. So, I mean, it's a bit, it's nice to say at times that everybody's in this to win and everybody's competitive, but the prize isn't always there on winning. And sometimes it doesn't drive people to do more than maybe circle a 8-8 type of a outcome.
Well,
I
we
just
got to
wanted
stop here.
Okay.
We got to our hour quickly, and it was because it was a really good conversation. Really appreciate each of you for giving us your thoughts, your expertise on this, and hopefully we'll come back soon and do this again. But it's been a great, very thought-provoking and insightful conversation. Many things that I hadn't thought of and heard, and even on this Tomlin piece, it gets back to that glass cliff theory, as you alluded to, Michael. If you can put somebody in a good context, right, a quarterback that can carry them, you can put them in a tradition where we stick by our coach. So you're going to get a longer time to kind of work out some of those kinks. It seems like we're back to a culture with owners who are invested. So to Greg's point, we want to find those owners who are invested, right? And them say that this is a part of their plan and to create that great culture. So thank you for being with us. Kendall.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. This was a fantastic discussion, and we would love to continue the conversation. If you do work in pro sports, we would love to have you join us. We have another room set up that we would love to have a debrief and an open Q&A with you. So we will be dropping that link in here in the chat. So please join us if you work in pro sports and are interested. This is brought to you by Pro Sport Assembly. And if you aren't yet a member of Pro Sport Assembly, we would love to have you look them up and join. So with that, we will end the show here and continue the conversation with our speakers in our debrief room.